Right, let's talk about the weather because things are about to get very interesting. If you've been finding the start to the year a bit mild and, well, soggy, get ready for a proper roller coaster. Over the next week or two, we are looking at a huge shift, with everything from a sudden wintry blast to a full-blown storm on the cards. So, in this explainer, we're going to unpack all of it, from the immediate frost and ice to a massive clash of air masses that's going to decide the fate of our winter.
Okay, so here's the plan. First up, we'll get into the immediate stuff, that winter's bite, the frost and ice that's already changing the feel of things. Then we're going to look out to the Atlantic, where the next storm is gathering strength. After that, something a bit different, we'll take a peek inside the forecast factory to really understand how and why weather warnings get made. Then it's time for the main event. We'll zoom right out for the epic battle for winter's return. And finally, we'll boil it all down to the key things you really need to watch for.
Right, let's get straight to it. If you've been thinking winter has been a bit of a letdown so far, maybe a bit damp, a bit dreary, but not properly cold, well, that is all changing. A proper blast of cold air is sweeping right across the country, and it's bringing some rather familiar wintry friends along for the ride. So what this means is that we are in for a real cold snap. You see, that milder air is being, well, unceremoniously shoved out of the way by a mass of colder air coming down from the northwest. So for many of us, it really is time to dig out the hats, the scarves, the gloves, because temperatures are set to properly plummet overnight. And this isn't just a touch of frost on the windscreen, this is a widespread, hard frost, with the genuine risk of some very icy patches on untreated surfaces.
Let's look at the details then. Tuesday night is when the cold really bites. There's already a yellow ice warning out for Scotland. And listen, this isn't just because of a few wintry showers. The bigger problem is that any meltwater from earlier in the day is going to refreeze as temperatures drop, turning pavements and roads into potential skating rinks. Now, Wednesday will start off crisp, cold, and for many, beautifully sunny. But don't let that fool you. We'll need to watch out for patches of freezing fog. That's basically a cloud on the ground, but its water droplets are super cooled, so they freeze instantly on anything they touch. And that stuff can be really slow to clear. But as always, the weather never stands still. New cloud and rain are already lining up to move in from the west later on Wednesday.
Now, that rain pushing in on Wednesday, it isn't just a passing shower. No, it's the opening act for the main event of the week, a developing low-pressure system that's currently brewing out in the Atlantic and it's heading our way. You can think of low pressure as this giant spinning column of lighter rising air, and as it moves, it just pulls in wind and weather like a huge meteorological vortex. And believe me, this one is packing a punch, with a deluge of rain and some pretty strong winds in store for Thursday. And that really is the million-dollar question for forecasters right now. We know an area of low pressure is coming, that's for sure, but its exact track and its depth, which basically tells us how intense it's going to get, well, that's still being thrashed out by the computer models. It might sound like a tiny detail, but a shift in that track of just 50 miles could be the difference between a breezy, wet day and a seriously disruptive storm. And that uncertainty has a huge bearing on who sees the very worst of the weather. This is where forecasting gets really fascinating. You get to see the science in action. We've got these incredible supercomputers running models that predict the weather, but, sometimes they just don't agree. The high-resolution UK model, for instance, at first had the storm tracking a bit further east, but the European model, which is a bit of a global forecasting heavyweight, well, that model, along with a whole load of others, are all pointing to a more westerly track. And that's the one forecasters are really watching closely, because it would give the storm more time over the sea to strengthen, potentially leading to a much more powerful system with stronger winds and heavier rain, especially for the south. But here's the thing. While there's still some debate about the exact wind strength, there is much higher confidence in the rainfall. In fact, a yellow rain warning has already been issued for a good chunk of southern England and Wales. We could see widespread totals of 20 to 40 millimeters, which is a lot of rain in a short space of time. But in some spots, particularly over higher ground like the moors or the Welsh Mountains, that could rocket up to as much as 70 millimeters. The real problem is that this is falling on ground that is already completely and utterly saturated from weeks of rain, which means it has absolutely nowhere to go. And that brings a very real risk of surface water flooding and some pretty significant travel disruption. All this talk of warnings and uncertainty is the perfect cue to pull back the curtain a little bit. Let's just take a moment to look at how these forecasts are communicated, because it really is as much an art as it is a science. And by using the recent storm Goretti as a case study, we can get a real insight into the logic behind those weather warnings that pop up on your phone. Right, here is the most important thing to understand about weather warnings. They're not just about the weather itself. It is all about the impact. Think about it.
A 60-mile-an-hour gust of wind on a remote Scottish hilltop in the middle of the night has a very different impact to that exact same gust hitting central London during the evening rush hour. Context is absolutely everything. So these warnings are designed to tell you how the weather will actually affect your day-to-day life, your home, and your community.
And this is how it all works. It's a really logical two-part system. First, the forecasters assess the potential impact level on a scale from low to high. Will it cause minor travel delays or could it pose a danger to life? Second, they assess the likelihood, which is really just their scientific confidence that those impacts will actually happen. A yellow, amber, or red warning is then issued based on where those two factors meet on a matrix. So it's a clever blend of potential severity and scientific certainty. Okay, let's look at a real-world example. Storm Gruddy. The initial warning was yellow for snow. Now, the potential impacts were actually pretty significant. We're talking medium-level stuff here, like travel chaos and power outages. But, and this is the crucial bit, the likelihood of them actually happening was considered low. And you can see that uncertainty reflected in the very cautious language that's used. Words like possible, could, may. It's all about managing expectations when you're not 100% sure, like where exactly that boundary between rain and snow was going to fall. But then, as the storm got closer, an amber warning was issued for a smaller, more targeted area. And here's the really interesting part. The potential impact was still the same, still medium. The only thing that had changed was the confidence. The likelihood was upgraded from low to medium. And you can see that shift reflected immediately in the language, which becomes so much more definite. Possible becomes are likely. This shows the forecasters were now much more certain that those disruptive impacts would happen in that specific amber zone. And that is exactly what we saw unfold. So, we've covered the next few days pretty thoroughly, but what about the bigger picture? Well, this is where things get truly fascinating. As we look towards next week, we need to zoom right out because we're about to see a massive clash between two enormous air masses, with the UK stuck right in the middle of a colossal meteorological tug-of-war. It's incredible, really, how connected our global weather system is. A powerful storm that developed on the other side of the planet, way over the Pacific Ocean, has sent this giant ripple of energy right through the atmosphere. It's just like throwing a huge stone into a pond. That ripple has traveled all the way across North America and is now heading out over the Atlantic. And its arrival is set to buckle the jet stream, that fast-flowing river of air high above us, making our whole weather pattern far more wobbly and a whole lot less predictable. And this is the battleground that ripple creates. So to our west, we still have the Atlantic, our usual weather maker, trying its best to send milder, wetter weather our way, though its influence is starting to fade away. But to our east and northeast, a huge and very stubborn block of high pressure is building over Scandinavia. Now, high pressure is the opposite of low. It's heavy, sinking air that acts like a defensive wall, bringing settled, dry conditions. And this particular high is tapping into a reservoir of very, very cold continental air. The question for next week is simple. Which one of these two titans wins out? So how on earth do we make sense of this battle? Well, this is where it gets very clever. By running the computer models hundreds of times, each with tiny little variations, we can build a picture of the most probable outcomes. And this chart shows a really clear trend. Just look at the top two slices, a chilly southeasterly and a cold easterly. Together, they account for nearly 60% of all the possibilities. Now compare that to the Atlantic-driven mild weather we're so used to, which is right down at just 10%. So while nothing is ever guaranteed in weather, the dice are becoming increasingly loaded towards colder, drier air from the continent, having a much bigger say in what we experience. So after all that, from ice warnings to jet stream ripples, what does it all actually mean for you? Let's bring it all back home and break down what you really need to keep an eye on over the next couple weeks. Okay, here's your essential checklist. In the immediate short term, it is all about the cold. Watch out for that widespread frost and the very real risk of ice. Then midweek, all eyes are on Thursday's system, bringing that heavy rain and gusty wind. As we head into the weekend, things look to slow right down, and that could lead to some rather, well, grotty, murky weather with a lot of low cloud and fog just trapped under what we call an inversion. And then for next week, the key phrase is a trend towards colder. It's not a done deal, not by any means, but the influence of that chilly continental air is looking more and more likely. And that leaves us with this final, thought-provoking question. We've certainly had a lot of weather to kick off the year, no doubt about it, but with the potential for a more sustained block of properly cold continental air to finally take charge, you really have to wonder, is the most classically wintry part of this season still to come? The battle between the Atlantic and the continent is so finely balanced, and it's going to be absolutely fascinating to see which one lands the knockout blow.